Indeed, thank you very much for the welcome, and thank you also for the invitation. It's a pleasure being here, and it's always a pleasure, particularly being back in Berlin, where I spent so many years, not only of my career, but also of my private life. So I'm actually, my background is German, I am German, but I have been working in a number of countries, as been mentioned, for many years outside Germany, and now I'm actually close by. I'm in a neighboring country in the Netherlands, and I'm working at the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights. To say a few words about that, it's often confused with sort of a National Institute of Human Rights. We are not like the German Institute of Human Rights, a national institute. We are a research institute. By the way, the oldest one that exists in academia. It was established in the early 80s when it started becoming sort of human rights became an own discipline. And nowadays you have human rights research institutes around the world, and almost every major university has one, but it was one of the earliest ones, and that's based in Utrecht. It's close to Amsterdam. What I'm trying to do with you today, because I looked at the program and then I looked at you, the participants, and I thought, oh my God, how not to bore them on a Monday morning. You must have heard so much about human rights, about treaties and UN and organizations, et cetera, et cetera. And also I thought, well, you know, I don't want to be the fifth speaker talking about concepts of democracy alone, like the standard ones that you can read in every bestseller. So I'm trying to do an experiment with you. And I'm trying to take you in a different time frame, let's say. So in 20 years from now, we're in 2030. So you must, you know, by then, most of you have probably succeeded in career and somewhere in this world. So position yourself somewhere in the world. Because one thing we're constantly complaining about currently, about the current human rights system and regime, as we call it. You all have heard about the human rights regime. We have the international, we have the regional ones, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, well, let's call it this system. That's maybe more and easier to understand. That a lot of people say it's not really functioning. We have currently, just to put us all on the same level, internationally, we have more than 300 legal binding treaties that deal with human rights. When I studied human rights in university some 20 years ago, I had to learn 6, 7 conventions, covenants, and that was it. And I had to read 1 or 2 books, and I knew it. Today, everybody who wants to work in the human rights field, whether it's a politician, a journalist, an NGO person, whatever, I can no longer tell students of mine, or when I do consultancies abroad, I can no longer tell, look, read that book, learn, you know, study the conventions. Probably the Political and Civil Rights Convention is the one that you're most familiar with, or that most of you have looked at. But all I can tell you is that maybe where to find the information about the conventions, the legal binding treaties, or what the difference between a legal and political binding treaty, because it's absolutely crucial if you work in the field of human rights and democracy. But so it's more kind of telling people where to find something and how to detect reliable human rights sources from non-reliable or confidential or non-confidential sources. So this whole thing is currently shifting, and therefore we often fall in the trap that we complain a lot about the current human rights system. It's not working. It's not really, implementation doesn't really work. And I'm very grateful for the previous speaker where he said, you know, we have all these countries around the world, 100, what did he say, 50, 60, who have actually agreed on the universal value of democracy out of 192. That's pretty good. And in the 1990s, when all these proclamation of democracy as a universal value, particularly after 93, I'm sure you have talked about it, Vienna conference, you know, everybody, China, on top of it, democracy, human rights value. But it's not working. So actually in the 1990s and now in the last 10 years it came about. It said we have your declaration, we have the country's pronunciation to democracy. But everybody covers his or her system right now with the title democracy is not working. So what some academics came up with, but not only academics, also practitioners, some years ago, they said, look, we need a different criteria to measure that, to link human rights and democracy and to measure it. And nowadays what, not only academics, but also when you go and work with international organizations, what they talk about is what is the difference between all these so-called democratic regimes and systems. And they talk about quality and effectiveness of democracy. We no longer, and that's another very important issue also if we want to look ahead and where we are in 2030 or 2020, 2030 and beyond, we no longer talk about, all right, there will be one point in a democratization process where we call a system consolidated democracy. This is very 70s, 80s, and the waves of democratization, etc., where observers say, look, there is one point of no return where we can give a government, a state, or system the label consolidated. It's like approved. Huh? And that is currently at the stake. And what we rather talk about constant democratization processes, and we're all part of it, and you more, in many of the, particularly in the emerging democracy countries, processes, and therefore they rather talk about different qualities, effectiveness, levels of effectiveness. So I'm trying to bring you there on this rather emerging concept of democracy. You can disagree with it, that's up to you. I try to provoke you a little bit and take you a little bit in the future. So we are in 2030, and state and governments are then no longer what they are right now. We have currently the debate about the dissolvement of nation state as we know it. It's not that nation states will disappear from one day to the other, but as we know it, we know one thing for sure. If we have particular human rights problems, but economic problems, whatever problems you have, there is no state who really can solve it by itself. So that's sort of an agreement, and therefore we have a lot of international organizations and meetings, et cetera, et cetera. G20 is the latest that's very interesting to watch, and their development in human rights as well. And we assume that in 20 years from now, there will be some, states will still exist in sort of governments, but they will have a different role. And they will have developed into kind of different actors. There's not this very clear top-down approach anymore. There are more and more mediators and managers, some call about management governance structures, that in some countries you already see. In the European Union you have that phenomenon, in other countries and other regions less. There are more mediators and managers between what we call the local level, or in the regional level, or the international level. So it's like a sandwich, like a burger, cheeseburger or something like that. So the governments are somewhere. And they mediate, they manage between the international level, and you've been talking a lot about the international level. We've heard it this morning, that the international level, basically the UN, but also here in Europe, something very exciting is going on now with the European Union and the Council of Europe and their norms and standards in human rights and merging, et cetera, et cetera. And how to implement these international values, because there's no state right now, actually no state that is taken serious, that develops human rights norms and standards by itself. You always work either in regions. We have this, we currently observe this with the African Union, but the Organization of American States, we even observe this in Asia. And so the state is becoming more a mediator between these international or regional norms and standard setting mechanisms for human rights, tries to implement it on the national level. And the local level, that's this new slogan of the United Nations, think global, act local. In the local level, somehow it has to be brought to the people. So they are mediators or managers between these three levels, if the regional one exists. And that constitutes in different kinds of organizations, institutions, agencies, and non-governmental organizations or non-state organizations. We turn more into saying non-state organizations. The NGO term is slowly vanishing, so you can probably also disagree with that, but we find it more difficult to just stick to the term NGO. And democratic institutions then will at the first sight, not so much differ from what we have today when we think about executive powers, legislative powers, of course, independent judiciary, etc. So the classics. Yeah? So we still have some of the classics, but maybe they are constituted a bit different. So we have democratic institutions. I'm naming them courts, parliament, executive powers, so governments, etc., so you know most of them. But their function is to monitor, to decide, to include and moderate, and to judge. So you say, well, nothing new, but just to get it, this is when we want to identify also democratic institutions and structures that might be helpful. They don't only decide and judge, but they often, and they more and more tend to include and moderate. And what about this inclusion? It comes shortly. So this is the one where, well, let's say, just to bring you back where we are standing right now. We have currently, and this is more and more increasing, what we call about the international human rights regime or system. We have national and local institutions, national governments, so that can be very different. Federal states is very different from centralistic states. And we have currently, well, one international organization, you all recognize that on the slide here. And then we have regional organizations. The OSCE is the one that's often least known to people who are not in Eastern Europe, but it's the largest regional organization existing in the world with 56 member states. Then we have the Council of Europe, which is what usually people are familiar with Strasbourg and the European Court of Human Rights. It's the far right from you. We have the Organization of the American States. You see the symbol down in the right corner. The American states, aiming at also including the United States more in their work, but it's not really happening. It's very much focused on Latin American countries. We have the European Union and we have the African Union, and you recognize the symbols. And why am I putting that? This is the major, what we call, when we talk about regional human rights systems, and they are actually the ones right now emerging and solving most of the human rights issues in their regions, and also cooperating with their governments. Less so in Asia for obvious reasons, because we don't have yet a regional human rights body or organization there. We hope that maybe ASEAN or some other institutions will convert into that, but it's not, for the moment, it's not happening. And nevertheless, a lot of my students always ask me, why does Europe have 3 and other regions have none? Can't you just share one, yeah, with other regions? There's a lot of history behind, so I have to go back into the Cold War to explain why, but nevertheless, the most elaborate regional human rights system is the one in Europe, and the different organizations actually tend not to overlap, but often they do actually in their work. Nevertheless, the other regions have one, and it's more and more emergent. They become more and more important also when we think about the new concept of how actually implementing international regional human rights norms on the domestic level, on the national level, and what governments have to do and how they actually have to change also in democratic terms to do so. I'm not saying the United Nations becomes less and less important, but what we probably will see over the next decades is they get sort of a lot of the UN human rights bodies, the Council, I'm sure you have talked about it, the different procedures, et cetera, it's getting bypassed by other regions. We already have the phenomenon here in Europe where when European countries come to the United Nations Council, they say, or the High Commission of Human Rights in Geneva, they say, oh, yeah, you have, leave us alone. You have so many institutions and mechanisms to deal with your human rights issues. We have enough in the backyard to deal with. So actually, we are already overwhelmed, and we are happy if we don't have to deal with regions where actually there is a human rights system in place. So that's what I mean also by the regional level, which plays an increasingly important role also in setting norms and standards. So what do I mean by including human rights in democratic structures? Again, try to detach yourself a little bit from a specific country that you think about. Okay, I know every of you can say immediately, but in Bhutan, but in China, but in Poland, but and so on. We all have stories. And I say I lived and worked for some time in China I can go on China for hours. But that's not, I'm trying to detach you a little bit from the specific country cases and say, what is here really the meaning? How do we really merge human rights and democracy? And what I try to do here is say, what are the kind of human rights we're talking about that can actually be fostered, controlled, monitored by democratic structures? And the kind of human rights, and I group them here, sort of an interest group human rights. Some call it a special group rights. Some call it, special treaties, etc., where we have legal binding instruments on minorities, on women, children, persons with disabilities, one of the latest conventions we have, migrant workers, refugee, and I could go on. These are the majority of treaties that we have, particularly over the last 20 years, are on specific groups. And you would say, so what? You know, why not? It's good for these groups. But it's highly debated right now whether this will actually lead to an enhancement of human rights for these groups if we have all these exclusive little pots of treaties. So I'm just trying to give you some food for thought. And then we have the civil and political rights, one of the oldest covenants, and the social, economic, and cultural rights. You're more familiar. And I just wanted to highlight here the difference. We have this very interest group, or group-orientated, specific group-orientated treaties, and then we have the two more general ones. We have also more general, there's discrimination, et cetera, other treaties, but the main ones are civil and political, and the social, economic, human, cultural rights. I know you're quite attentive, and I know we have limited time, but I would just like to know briefly from whether you're still with me, because I'm jumping here a little bit. Is there anybody of you has an idea why we have the two conventions? Because we're constantly talking about it, but we lose sight often why we have. It was not meant in '48, of course. Eleanor Roosevelt and her team. There was no intention whatsoever to ever have two conventions. She wanted one convention right out of the UDHR. But any idea why we have this legacy here that we're struggling with since 20 years? The Cold War. Yeah, it's a legacy of the Cold War. And we're trying to overcome this because of the world powers at that time. Everybody needed a little bit. It's treaty. That's in a nutshell. There's a process. Took 20 years and longer. But we're trying to overcome this since 20 years with different struggles to join the both of them. By the way, if you have a look at the Disability Convention, there you might find a very, very interesting move to trying to merge all the human rights. Very interesting document from a human rights point of view. So what do democratic institutions then actually do to promote these human rights standards that we have right now? I'm just, you say, oh, she's very theoretical, she's very general. I'm just trying to detach. We still have time to come to more concrete cases. Well, first of all, what's the criteria for these democratic institutions? They can be international, they can be national, they can be local. Democratic institutions in the future, it's not like whether they call them democratic or not. It's more about what criteria do we apply when is someone democratic or not, in order also to not only promote human rights, but also benefiting from human rights. And first of all, we would say, well, they have to guarantee freedom from want, dignity, and security. They have to guarantee human rights. And they have to be able to control adherence, compliance, and implementation of human rights. It's quite a threshold. Not many countries, particularly most countries, they suffer great corruption, political and economic corruption, and their control actually vanishes. You have countries in the world where state is actually absent from certain parts of their country, and there's no control at all. And they have to be able to promote, monitor, enhance equality and equity of all people. So guarantee, control, promote. Sounds very simple, but when you think about this, can every institution you look at, whether it's a court, it's a parliament, legislative powers, local authorities, international authorities, are they actually capable of doing it? And then you already would say, yeah, I give a plus here and a minus here and so on. So the first step. And that's what I promised you at the beginning. What we are doing now, we're trying to not think again about this the classic concept of a government, and the government has to, and the government has to. The fact is often governments can no longer do, either because of conflicts in their countries or because they're already so much intertwined with international organizations or instruments and or have given up power to the local areas that it's not longer the government alone that we have to look at when we think in the future. So these are criteria. This is now very academic probably, but a lot of empirical research is currently done about this. And I heard earlier the questions, you know, what is really, how do we not only measure, but also how do we define all this democracy? And this is an attempt to really universal, let's say, democratic definition. And what I present you is not my ideas here alone. You know, there are many people working on it. There are different papers and books out there. And this is sort of a summary. This is sort of the best of that you find right now in that field. So very much about accountability. Sometimes we also feel like we can't hear it anymore. So we hear so much about accountability. What is it really? Anyway, I put it here. And accountability, transparency, and what is probably more concrete, and again, play through in your mind, responsiveness of governmental leadership or leadership as such to human rights norms, standards, and treaties. Legal or political binding mechanism, that doesn't matter. So maybe the best way to describe also accountability and transparency is how responsive is an institution that we call democratic, or when there's, for instance, human rights claims, when there are obvious human rights abuses, etc., or people bringing it up to them. Are they actually taking this on board or not? Or do they mean that they know all the answers by themselves? Secondly, the capability of parliaments or legislative powers to constrain executive powers. I think we've heard that earlier too, when abusing or violating human rights. So what we often call checks and balances simply. Participation was asked early. Participative and inclusion of participation and inclusion of civil societies, NGOs, that's usually what we mean by it, social movements and electorate in norms and standard setting procedures. The question was earlier, is there only elections, can we measure it, or if we have an electoral turnout of 40%, 50% in a country? The answer from that kind of analytic point of view would be yes. Because they don't reduce democracy on election polls, on an election that takes place every 4 or 5 years. They would say if society in general participates in the decision-making process, that could be through agencies, through NGOs, through movements, and if governments, leaders take up their claims, respond to them, that is already a quality of democracy. So you don't have to wait until the next election comes up, and maybe you're on holiday anyhow when it comes. So that means nothing about the quality of a democracy in a country. The electoral turnout is one minor criteria among many criteria. But you notice a big difference whether you have, for instance, you go into countries, and you all have experienced that in various occasions, when you go to countries where people immediately say, look, I don't go to election, I'm not participating in any protests or anything, it makes no sense. There is no responsiveness of my government. That is an indicator. But if you go to other societies, and the American society was mentioned here, where people constantly are engaged in different kinds of organizations, you would say, okay, maybe electoral turnout from 40% or so, and yeah, it's not very nice. But that doesn't mean that there is a lack of democracy. So that's the criteria here. Apply egalitarian principles and the rule of law. You probably have heard this many times. And human rights through legitimized enforcement authorities, whatever that can be. You know, there could be, of course, parliaments, local parliaments also, but courts, etc. And the functioning of an independent judiciary, which sounds simple, it's one of the most difficult, and usually the criteria that comes last in every checkbox that you do on a country. But usually that turns down quality standards very, very easily, because very few countries really can say that they have an independent judiciary. And you have, and that is, it's another sort of soft criteria. It's sometimes very difficult to measure, but we should nevertheless keep it in mind. What they call nowadays civic and social trust in state institutions. And I give you an example. I also worked in post-Soviet countries. I worked for some years in Armenia there, and in the Caucasus. And you say the Caucasus is a quite problematic region, and etc. So when I went and did some human rights work there, I asked the people, how do you solve your problems when they have property rights is a big issue there, housing rights is a big issue there, houses get teared down, someone's building a new skyscraper, whatever. And I say, well, how do you do? Don't you go to the police? Don't you go to the court and make claim? It's in the constitutions, it's in your treaties. Armenia has ratified everything on this planet. And they said, well, no, are you crazy? You're one of these naive Western, human rights activists or what? No, I asked a cousin. He has a Kalashnikov, and he solves the problem. And you hear this in many regions of this world. You say, are you crazy? I would never go to the police. The police is corrupt, the court is corrupt, parliamentarian is corrupt. They would never help me. I know it's there, they're there, and international observers come and they're all pleased, it's there. But I call my cousin. So that is when you say, actually, you give a big minus on civic and social trust in public institutions that actually have to protect also your human rights or enhance that. So that's just an example that probably you have many more in your mind. We have also, and that will not vanish in the future, you also say, well, that's very fine. If I go through in the future and analyze institutions, it's not like whether they call themselves democratic or not. It's like what you decide, or you make the checking and say, is there really a democratic institution that fosters, I think it's from this one, all right? No, I have to go through though. That fosters human rights or has it in its preamble or wherever, but whether you actually say, look, there's an international organization, there's a national one or a local one that actually acts democratically, from what I said, just no. Now it's low. So give me 3 more minutes and I should be through this. So there are threats to human rights and democracy. I'm just mentioning them here. This is not an exhaustive list. But something has been mentioned earlier, and I thought it was funny because I had it in my slides here. I love the quote from Saudi Arabia. So one more, yeah. So of course we have terrorism, we have non-state actor violence, we have, as I say, territories where there's no state control, etc. Not denying that. We have race segregation and caste system. It's a huge debate with Indian colleagues whether they can actually, India still call it a democracy, whether if in practice it doesn't really work. You have exclusion of groups, and that's maybe the detail that sort of comes in a little bit, almost new in this whole democratic and human rights debate. A lot of observers go into countries and they say, well, yes, you have ratified all the treaties, and you go to the UN constantly, and you have it all on the paper. But do these groups, do all the relevant groups in your society, whether minorities, but also women and migrants, and migrants is one of the really, really major issue in the next decades to come, whether migrants are included in the democratic decision-making process of your country. And because by standards, they have right to do so. But in practice, often we find many, many reasons why we don't include them here in Europe as elsewhere. So the European Union is actually one of the examples where we find great difficulties. And then we have something that has been mentioned earlier about veto powers. I call them veto powers. It could be military. We just have seen the case of Turkey where after 60, 70 years they tried to diminish the veto power of the military in their democratic system. And we have something what you said earlier, is kings, monarchies, police, families, etc. And I like the example, the quote from Prince Sultan from Saudi Arabia. They actually were holding some sort of election because they had what you were saying. They had, agreed, well, some democracy in Saudi Arabia, and the UN said, oh, even if you don't have women voting rights, fine, but anyway, so go ahead. Well, and he said, okay, we can hold elections and afterwards declare our royal family victor over 99% of the votes. True democracy is what I define democracy, and is when we care for the needs of our citizens. And it's not only Saudi Arabia. You hear this in China, you hear this in many, many countries. We think, we want to protect the citizens. And yes, there are bits and pieces of human rights given to the citizens often to calm them, but it's not. If you don't really do it systematically and structurally, it will not work. So, in democratic societies or institutions in 2030, we have to be sort of aware, not only now, but more so. I just want to get away from this typical nation-state example and say, yeah, Luxembourg is doing and Sweden is doing and Pakistan is not doing it. I think that's not really, really helpful, honestly. But when we think it's about including interests of all the relevant groups in society. We mentioned the different elderly, children, women, homosexuals, different political parties, interests, and let them negotiate. Of course, there is a majority and a minority principle, but you have to have public debates. You have to have negotiation. You have to collectively agree and participate on binding rules and policies. And you have to establish monitoring and control mechanisms. We need them. We cannot imagine yet really of a system, a society that doesn't have them. So maybe you can think of something. And we have to still build institutions that control, monitor, and act and enforce human rights. So it's very much about institutions, but these institutions will only work, also in terms of human rights, if there is civic public trust in these institutions. Or otherwise, it's just really on the paper, and we see it regionally, internationally. We see it in Europe, we see it internationally, we see it nationally, and we see it locally. Thank you very much. I hope I have sort of provoked you enough to question some of the hypotheses I gave you. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Babu, and I come from Senegal. You talked about including the interests of all relevant groups. And I was wondering what will happen if there is a kind of conflict of interest between two groups. For instance, if there is we have obviously in Senegal a conflict of interest between homosexual groups and also religious group, knowing that the majority of, even if we are in a secular country, more than 90% of the population are Muslims. So we have obviously this kind of conflict of interest. And I was wondering, what is your opinion about it? Thank you.
Yes, good morning. My name is Ronald, and I come from Venezuela. I just want to ask you something, because lately in Venezuela we have some conflicts. I'm part of Amnesty International in Venezuela and also in Aalborg in Denmark, with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, because become only for give a human rights report that don't please the Chavez government, political prosecuted. So we have to be really careful what we do and how we do it. So my question is, do you still have faith in Amnesty International work in Venezuela, even this enormous constraint that we face every single day? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Azumi. I'm from Japan, and I just I know you're trying to be more like broad, but because I'm from Asia, it's quite interesting. What is the reason, the biggest factor preventing Asia to have like a regional treaty on human rights? Because you say it will be really important, regional actors in like next 20 years, but we still don't have one. And I would like to ask, what is your opinion and what is important for us to, actually create that kind of organization? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very diverse question, very interesting question. Conflict of interest. Very real in any country of this world, by the way, but there are some countries where the majorities are so obvious. As you say, there's a religious minorities with certain values that counteract maybe to international human rights standards. But that's, I would say, maybe half of the world you find something like that. And I mentioned in one of my slides the role also of governments more and more of being mediators and being managers between the different values or the different interests. I mean, it's probably a typical conflict resolution kind of mechanisms that you will have to apply there as in any other case too, to make compromises, to mediate, to make compromises. But then now it becomes very political. What usually works, and this is not now the answer to all the problems, but what people in conflict resolution or mediation said, well, the moment we bring everybody on the table, whether majority or minority, to agree that they all will benefit from the change that we actually propose, and even if it's a minor change. And I give you an example, maybe it's better clarify, because I can't give you the solution to that, but I can maybe give you an example. Pakistan is also a Muslim-dominant country, and it's a very patriotic country, and in the villages where you have mainly few men dominating and ruling, etc., etc. So the UN. UNICEF went in and UNIFEM went into some of these rural areas, and they had programs. They had all the signatures from the government to change not only the living condition of children, but also women. So, and the elders, that's usually a council of elders. Most of the countries have them, and the council of elders said, no, you're not coming in here with your treaties and promoting rights of women and children. This is all rubbish. It's not in our value system. And so the workers, the international workers, they were very hopeless, and they thought, damn, how do we do it? And someone said, look, you're very proud of your sons, maybe less of your daughters. That's also reality in many countries. Families, they want to have sons. But in order to have healthy sons that go to school and become chiefs of the village maybe one day, you have to have healthy and educated women. And the elders said, yes, you convinced me. So women got health care, education, etc. So it's also, this is now in a nutshell, you have many of these examples. That's a tactic. You're trying to find the common denominator. How do majorities benefit from the change? So how would the Muslim community actually benefit, or the ones, maybe it's not all of them, but the ones who dominate the discourse right now, to actually make the change in the society, maybe less violence, more confidence, whatever it could be. I'm not a specialist on Senegal, but there's these mechanisms and tactics. And I would also argue, whenever you want to get change in a society, also in terms of human rights, you have to find the common denominator and the benefit for all. And that means you really have to decline human rights through the whole system. It's not easy. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International in Venezuela. So are you saying you're promoting the reports? Are you part of it? Is that I have to? Yeah. Okay.
In Venezuela and also in over in Denmark.
Yeah. Okay. So you're actually suffering repercussions from what I know. When the annual report comes out, etc., etc. And how to do this? Whether Amnesty would have confidence in continue to promote it. From what I know from my own experience, of course, with Amnesty and also working with the London team, is that, of course, one of the mantra of Amnesty is, even if we can't enter the country, even if we can't present the report there, and if there is a threat to our people there, they have to sort of stop working because then nobody should be injured. But the web or from the outside, we of course continue to write the reports, and Human Rights Watch does the same. Also, maybe sometimes Human Rights Watch dares to go a little bit step further than Amnesty International, where Amnesty really says, well, our members should be protected first, but Human Rights Watch doesn't really have members, so there's not much protection needed in the country. But nevertheless, yes, of course. Go ahead. It's a mantra, and that is something that maybe I can share that from what was mentioned earlier. When I did my investigation for the book that I wrote on Amnesty in the DDR, I worked on purpose on what they called at that time a closed communist society, because Amnesty for 30 years were writing letters at that time and sending them to the president or whatever, the government of that particular country, East Germany, and never got an answer. And they continued for years, for years, for years. So when the wall came down, we had the opportunity to look at the files, the internal files of that system. We never, ever, one single answer for 30 years. So anyway, wall came down, you could look at the archives, and what you found is that these letters, these reports, as you say, the internet page, the journalists that kept asking, they actually caused an internal debate within the system and changed the attitude to that. They made, they would never, a government like that, and even so I wouldn't consider Venezuela yet as a totalitarian regime, but it's definitely not democratic. And Chavez would never go and say, oh, it's because of an Amnesty or Human Rights Watch report, so forget about that. But internally, and I think you shouldn't lose confidence there. I think there is something happening. I hope so. Japan, Asian or regional rights regime. I try to make it brief because it's a debate going on for 20, 30 years. Why the hell? And just imagine, you know this of course better, 2/3 of the world population is living in this region. And sometimes, and that's why my Chinese students, when I was in China, said, well, you have 3 organizations in tiny Europe, and we have none. So share one. But what is the reason? And I think this is part of the answers. Why have some continents or regions like the European region or the European continent, if you want, has 3 organizations to protect, promote, monitor, etc., and the court and everything, and why others not? This, if you go back to the roots, maybe you find an answer there. At least it's what I try to help myself to understand Asia better, because there's so many problems, if you want to say. But what we bring back the European human rights system is what they call national catharsis. I don't know if this is good translation. It's tiredness. People say if there wouldn't have been World War II, and just imagine there was a room like this with people like you sitting, about the same number, deciding not only on the UDHR, just a few months after the UDHR in 1948, the European Convention for Human Rights was drafted with almost the same people in the room, except for the Chinese, the Americans, etc. But they all were just tired of what they had seen, what they had witnessed, what they have felt physically. Everybody in that room had a personal story of the losses he or she had in the war. And today, analysts say it was a window of opportunity. You have to take this regional tiredness to establish a new institution. Otherwise, 10 years later, it would have not happened. And then also when you look through the other institutions, why they were built, they're usually what they call a national catharsis, a national tiredness, and we want to make a change. We leave your personal issues behind and just the common denominator, find it and establish an institution. And this has to be democratic in a way, otherwise it will not last. And and observers on Asia say, there seems to be no national catharsis that India and China, and these are the 2 ones you have to have on board when you talk about Greater Asia, or Australia, if you take Asia Pacific and Indo-Japan, we can't really see this catharsis, or regional catharsis, this regional tiredness, what they share yet. And that might be one of the reasons why it's not working yet. But you can maybe create one. Who knows? Are you tired now already? National catharsis. Yeah, oh, good.
I'll have to apologize because I'm going to make a quote. There was a gentleman or a woman who said that if you want to judge a society, just look at its prisons. I'll say this, what I'm about ready to say, as a former corrections officer. The United States has 25% of the prisoners, world population of prisoners, within its borders. 200,000 whites, 600,000 Latinos, 1.5 million black men and women. As a contrasting point, if we consider the prison population of Germany, which is roughly around 80,000, 40,000 black women are imprisoned in the United States, which represents 50% of the total prison population of Germany. The 1.5 million black men is certainly out of proportion to their number in the population. My question to you, to Amnesty International, is why is there this reluctance to deal with that question openly, actually condemning it, investigating it, and being part of the movement to uncover the reasons why this is happening? Another case in point, we have a soldier here, a black soldier by the name of Andre Shepard, who has just recently received an award from the Panther Prize from the TOTS. And he has applied for political asylum here in Germany and under the Nuremberg laws. Now, what is your position on 25% of the world's population being imprisoned in the United States, and how can Amnesty International help soldiers, and there are a lot of them out here who are condemning the war in Afghanistan and Iraq? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so should we take that? Yeah.
Okay, my name is Rosa Ektam. I'm from Germany. You were speaking about civic trust and saying that in some countries or many countries, maybe people say, oh, we'll never go to the police, never go to the court because they won't be able to help me. So I was wondering whether you limit this civic trust to trust into institutions or the proper functioning of institutions, or whether it also includes groups and different parts of society trusting each other. That's all.
Okay, my name is Fahrizal from Indonesia. You told that the threats to human rights is terrorism, and in Indonesia we have serious problem the terrorism. Indonesian government make repressive method to catch the terrorists. Example, the policeman shoot and kill terrorist suspect in front of his wife and his children. What my question is, how to decrease the threats, how to decrease the terrorists, in your opinion? Thank you.
Don't have the final answers. If I would have, probably would, the world would look different, but I don't. The one on Amnesty, I'm not representing Amnesty here, I have to say that, and I'm out of being a member of the board of the Amnesty Germany. I think Benjamin would be the better person to address on that. I just know from, let's say, being also a strategy advisor to the headquarters in London and others, that since Amnesty is working on the US since the 60s, right from the beginning, that has been an issue, and that was really when actually apartheid was still almost in place in the 60s in the United States. That issue is one of, I would say it's actually one of the issues that has been constantly addressed. I don't know any Amnesty report on the United States where it hasn't been addressed that African Americans, so sort of the majority in prisons, and that it has to do something with the root causes why they are in, because the lawyers are a reason, can they afford a proper lawyer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that there's actually also racist motives in the game. So it's not, I think it's not a lack of addressing it. And I know also from the colleagues from the Amnesty office in Washington, D.C., that that's one of the major reasons or major part of their work. And then also because they are among the highest that receive the death penalty, et cetera, et cetera. So I would give Amnesty there, and I think also other human rights organizations, not only Amnesty International, that is one of the big issues. Why haven't they really succeeded in making a difference? Of course, some people could maybe say, right, look, it would be probably worse if there wouldn't be this constant, like a mantra saying, look, watch out. There seems to be a pattern in the, let's say, even the rule of law system in the United States, why these people are so overproportioned. It's not only because of the level of crime, but also the root causes for that crime. There might be a pattern in the society, and why are you not tackling it? So, but then again, the first thing I have to say, the Amnesty and other human rights organizations are not silent to it, and there are also some good investigations on actually the root causes, and you try to bring it up to the decision makers to say, well, we know the root causes, start working on it. But we should also not overestimate the power of NGOs, and I think we sometimes tend to do it, particularly when we are frustrated with our governments that they're not doing something in a particular field. Can't the NGOs solve the problems? No, they can't. Their power is basically a good report, publicity, and trying to speak to the right people maybe in government and decision-making process if they can approach and reach them. And I would give them, most of the human rights NGOs, also Human Rights Watch, the benefit of the doubt that they do their utmost. And maybe, yes, maybe they can say, look, we assume that there's more sensitivity in public among judges, among social workers about this issue, and that is already an achievement. So as far as I can go, but definitely Amnesty has it in its reports. Therefore,
Just one comment. But if you look at the map, they're always painted green.
What is green? This is Freedom House. They take Amnesty reports. I agree. Yeah, they take. But
I'm just saying,
yeah.
Everyone looks at the map, and at least there should be a question mark.
Okay. Well, then I have a good tip to you. Look at the Bertelsmann Transformation Index. They have different criteria there. But the Freedom House I find very problematic. But that's a footnote. Trust. First of all, you ask about specific and trust in institutions. Classically, yes, it's about institutions that you have in place and how to make use of it. But it's also trust among civil society. You could say so. It's much more difficult to measure that kind of trust. It could start, one indicator could be, if civil society, citizens or whatever, have trust more or less in themselves. And what I said earlier, sometimes when you go to countries and you've found this in interviews or when talking to the people where they say, yes, I just came back from Russia, so I have the Russian example there. It was actually devastating. Now people say, look, yeah, we would like to protest, and we are not agreeing with the regime Putin. Yeah, we are not happy, but it's useless. Oh, there's someone who wants to fund an NGO. It will make no difference. So that would be a lack of trust even among the societal groups. Not even to speak about trust in institutions which hardly exist there anyhow. So yes, terrorism fight. I always, because a lot of times we Europeans, we very much like to point at these countries, look at the horrible terrorism, etc. I like to take the examples of more or less successful terrorism combating in Europe. We have the ETA terrorists now for 40 years almost, 40 years. In Spain, separatist movement. We have the IRA in the United Kingdom. We have the Corsica, the movement. We had the Red Army fraction terrorism in Germany. And we have sort of short kind of terrorist uprisings. But these are the ones that, let's say, the most prominent in Western Europe. And some you would say, well, they don't no longer exist. And some are constantly on the same level. Some have decreased. How do you do this? And maybe there are certain patterns. The first thing that I know, best case I know actually in Spain and the ETA terrorism which is going on. And the worst was when actually they were trying to fight terrorism there. the bombing attacks, et cetera, terrorism, with anti-terror units of the police. That's actually when it increased. They had an off-state anti-terror. Most of the countries have it, even if they would never commit it. It only comes out.
Which country was this?
Spain. They had the GAL in the 80s, and they were off limits, and they just went into and they were shooting the terrorists in whatever villages. So it all came out, big scandal. But that was a time when it was actually worse. It changed, and now we'll see Spain in the next years, of course, but it changed the moment, first of all, where they say, well, how do terrorists recruit themselves? Why are constantly these 18-year-old young people joining terrorist groups? Don't they have a future ahead? Can they do something else? So they started looking at the young people, what's actually their motivation. Plus, it changed also when they finally admitted, not only the Spanish government, also the UK government, they say, well, we can never really eradicate all terrorists. We have to be honest to the citizens. We have to be honest to the public to say there will always be a group of 4 or 5 who just don't want it. They just do it for the sake of it. But if we can diminish that group, out of that, say, the 10,000 supporters they have right now, limited to 5,000, limited to 500, limited to the last 20. That is a way to approach terrorism fight. And that is what they started doing in Spain, and that's what they started doing in the UK. And be honest to the citizens. We cannot promise you there will be no bomb attack in the next 20 years. But what we try to do is to diminish the supporters, to tackle the root causes. There comes democratic institutions, and to include them, to bring them on the table, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that has made a big shift in this. As you can see, we still have terrorism, so it's not like the one solution, but it's sometimes interesting to see why terrorism disappeared and why it's still prevailing. And there you find patterns. That's as much as I can give of an answer.
You didn't answer the question about the soldiers.
The soldiers. What, sorry, then you have to.
I asked about Anja Mihr, the soldier who applied for political asylum.
Okay. Oh, that particular case, I just simply don't know. Maybe Benjamin knows. I don't know about this.
Yeah, you told me about it already.
Okay, so I'm sorry. I just don't know. I'm not even living in Germany anymore. Yeah.
Can you just broaden it out a little bit? What is Amnesty International doing about the complaints of soldiers in the United States military and British, also the British military, who are bringing back their evidence on crimes against humanity,
Yeah.
human rights?
Yeah.
I mean, are they supporting that? Are they supportive of that
Yeah.
effort? Are they looking? Obviously, there's a disconnect in terms of the information.
Mm.
And I'm going to deliver it to you publicly and personally. But it seems to me there is this disconnect, and perhaps maybe you could speak to that. You know,
It's usually just like any information that comes up to Amnesty. First of all, you submit information not only Amnesty but Human Rights Watch. When you observe as a passively or actively, usually through the web or with a phone call, you try to get through. But I always recommend to people who have witnessed severe human rights abuses anywhere in this world, when they ask us, and how can I, nobody's listening to me. How do I get, as I always say, look, prepare a very well dossier. Just not just write an email saying, I saw this and this and this. But a very well established to say where it says, look, I personally visited that. I have some documents here. I have some newspaper articles there that sort of underline my argument. A dossier will have a better chance to be read by the researcher that is in charge in that case of asylum or U.S. questions. That's the best. If you just send an email, it won't work probably.
Professor Dr. Anja Mihr, thank you very much.
Yeah.
You keep it fresh. You keep it in the rest of your